Welcome, friends. Give us all a moment to get settled. Wow, that didn't take long. Everyone's really excited. My name is Maria Eisnagel. I serve as Education Director here at the Highland Center for Natural History, and we just want to extend our warmest welcome to you today on this glorious, warm spring day. Any first-timers to the Highland Center in the audience? Awesome. Welcome. Welcome. We are a nature center on 80 acres of land through special use permit with Prescott National Forest. And we're pleased to offer this Community Nature Study Series, which is a long-standing program of the Highland Center, now in conjunction with our local Arizona Master Naturalist chapter. So we have our Central Highlands Master Naturalist chapter with lots of representation in this room right now. It's a very robust program. The fourth cohort of students is moving on through and about to finish the program. It's offered annually, and so if you're thinking, I wonder what that's about, please talk to one of us afterwards. We also have a lot of materials over here at the exit that you can pick up and learn more about what it means to be an Arizona Master Naturalist and how you might pursue that with the goal of volunteering in the community. So the Highland Center, although we are on federal land, we are not funded governmentally. We're a nonprofit, and so you'll notice that we have this nice donation bowl over here if you do feel so inclined before you leave. If you are able to donate, it really does help us to be able to continue to provide this quality educational programming for free and for fun. So if you're able to do that, we greatly appreciate it. If you're not a member and would like to become a member, that's a really fun way to engage as well. So you can look at our website for more information about that. Our mission is to help children and adults discover the wonders of nature and become wise caretakers of the land. And did any of you happen to see the field trip kids out here? Did you get here early? And I think that one of our audience participants might have led one of those field trip groups. So we effect our mission through all sorts of programs and opportunities for people of all ages, so the littles to adults and even custom programs for, I would say adults and beyond. So we have our summer camps that we're gearing up for. We have a variety of really incredible adult learning opportunities. So check out our kiosk on your way out or our website. A couple of those, we have a springtime wreath making workshop coming up. We have an adult field trip to Tonto Natural Bridge State Park. That's going to be a lot of fun in a couple of weeks. And all sorts of other opportunities. So please do check those out. Any questions about the Highland Center before we introduce our speaker for the day? One additional note that I should have led with, because it's very important, where are the restrooms, right? So out this door around the building, there's a beautiful sculpture there, and there's a restroom house behind it. So please do take care of yourselves in whatever ways that you need to. There's a water fountain right there as well. And our nature store is open for your perusement after the presentation. It's been newly rejuvenated and there's lots of cool goodies in there. So that's my plug for our Benson Family Nature Store. So we'll go ahead and introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Jeb Bevers teaches biology courses and mentors undergraduate research at Yavapai College here in Prescott, Arizona. Professor Bevers' doctoral research focused on the microevolution and recolonization of pikas on the volcanically impacted landscape of Mount St. Helens in Washington State. A master's degree in biology from Portland State University researched the biogeography of Tasmanian mammals. In 2011, Professor Bevers instructed a course in ecology conservation and interactive educational outreach to grade schools in Paraguay under a Fulbright Scholar Grant. Current research areas include fossil surveys and a small museum collection of 3 terrestrial sites in Arizona and 19th century biology and paleontology. His sabbatical activities in 2022 and a follow-up in 2023 included research on Alfred Russel Wallace's annotated book collections and a rediscovery of mollusks at several institutes in the UK. Beyond class instruction and current research work, Jeb has developed an eco-tour he intends to co-lead for Wild Latitudes to Papua New Guinea in 2025. Please help me welcome Dr. Jeb Bevers.
Thank you for attending, and hopefully you're not too unhappy that I will announce that I've been told I have more than an hour to talk. So I'm going to make use of that and keep some questions going if you want as well. But who here has heard of Alfred Russel Wallace? Raise your hand if you've heard of Wallace. Okay. Who here has heard of Charles Darwin? Raise your hand. Oh, yeah. I think that at a minimum, Wallace should have equal billing with Darwin. If history had been slightly different, he would have had top billing. But we'll discover that in a little bit. And evolutionary biology, paleontology, mammalian mammalogy are some of my areas of study and interest, but I've also been interested in the history of science. And at Oregon State University, I took a course in my senior year in biology, which was the history of biology, and I loved that course. I even considered possibly going into graduate school on history of science. And then on a first sabbatical, 7 years prior to the last one in 2022, I went and looked a little bit at the history of evolution and biology, paleontology in the UK, because that was an important area of origin for these fields. And when I was at the Linnean Society Library, a few books by random that I was looking at noted on the inside cover a little plaque that stated this was donated to the library, and it was from the personal library of Alfred Russel Wallace. And looking through a couple of those books, I also noted there were some annotations, and I spoke to the librarians about that, and they said they were not aware of this. So I became quite aware of that, and he's been an interest of mine. So I followed up with them and did more work on this the last sabbatical, and then a little follow-up in 2023. And the Linnean Society has about 360 volumes of Wallace's private library, and not every book did he annotate, but quite a number he had. And I did discover that a couple of books biographers had already looked at, but no one has looked at all of them. So I just went wild and looked at all of them, and a friend of mine assisted me on part of this. And then I also went to the University of Edinburgh, and they also have a large amount of Wallace's books, and we covered about 140 of those. But mostly I'll be telling you about Wallace's life and a little bit on some of the books. So what did Wallace do, and how do we know about him, or perhaps not know enough about him? He did write 22 books in his lifetime. He published, depending upon the author you look at, anywhere from 800 to over 1,000 articles in his life as well. And he was a co-founder of a little journal that you might have heard of called Nature. He was interested in a wide variety of fields. Natural history was probably the one that he spent most of his time focusing on, but he was also made important contributions to anthropology, cultural anthropology, and he was also interested in socialism, which I am too, actually, and he was interested in exobiology, and he did a critique of Lowell's Life on Mars books with the canals. He was not a fan of Lowell in that regard, and he was also interested in spiritualism, which was a pretty big rage in late Victorian Europe. And here, how did he accomplish all this? Well, what would Wallace do? These are some things which I put together, which I believe that Wallace would do, and I would say that Wallace would certainly support all of the things that are done right here. I think he would endorse this center. Well, he learned all of his life. Quite often, he just did a lot of his learning on his own. He had to. He made good contacts. He made really good use of those contacts. He set goals, which is something that I always propose to my students at the beginning of class. What are your goals? And I think that everyone should set goals, no matter what age you are, and continue on setting goals and revising those. He worked and pushed forward on these. He overcame obstacles, and boy, did he have a lot of obstacles, which he did overcome. He adapted when things were not going well. He did something else, and it always, well, he always was able to work it out. He mastered his field. Actually, fields. He was a real Renaissance person and mastered many fields, and he continued to make new plans and goals. He was born in 1823 on the border between England and Wales in near a little town called Usk. His father had been trained as a lawyer, but he never practiced. I don't know why. He did not, but he did not, and instead he kept going into various failed businesses, mostly revolving around books, publishing, literature. He was a big fan of literature, and the family, as several biographers have indicated, was downwardly mobile. So by the age he was 13, he had to quit his grammar school. He got about the equivalent of an 8th grade education, and then was told that he had to go work. So he began to work with his eldest brother, William, who was a surveyor, and his other brother, John, also began surveying work with him. They went around the English-Welsh countryside. He thoroughly enjoyed this, and he took to botany. How many people are into botany? All right, so that's what Wallace started on first. I never started on botany, but I have taken it. And he also interacted at night. Instead of going to the pub and using his funds that way, he would go to these Hall of Science discussions, where they would discuss the latest in technology and sometimes philosophies. And here he was introduced to a fellow Englishman, Richard Owen, who was the founder of the English socialist movement and also highly influenced Wallace. He was, as I said, self-taught, and one of the things he learned as he was surveying, his brother William let him know a little bit about geology, and he was just thunderstruck about this field of geology and that fossils represented an ancient life, because he had no knowledge of this before. He took to reading this. How many people are fans of libraries? You would not be hearing about Wallace if there were not public libraries, because he could not afford hardly any books at this early age of time. He did buy a botany book, one of his first, but otherwise he went to local libraries and he learned about things, and he read materials such as Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. Lyell was a founder of modern geology, not the first person to work in it, but a very substantial founder of that. And in his Principles of Geology, Lyell highlighted that the Earth is quite old, at least hundreds of millions of years. They had no idea exactly on how old it was, and that the slow and gradual process of sedimentation and erosion that you see today, which you can measure, could also be used to deduce the relative age of, say, cliffs that are several hundreds of feet high. And from that, that it's quite old. And also that there's abundant fossils of life that's no longer here. These fossils set about demarking different geologic time periods, such as the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. And Wallace was, he's just absorbing all of this. But he also notes that Lyell does not indicate there's extinctions, but what about transmutations, which was the term of the time, or evolution? How did these new forms arise? After surveying for about a decade, he took a job teaching at the collegiate school in Leicester, England, where he instructed surveying and sketching. And he's a pretty good sketch artist. He also learned a little bit of algebra from the headmaster, and he got to know this other young man, Henry Walter Bates, who was a local naturalist enthusiast, just like Wallace was. Wallace was, into the botany, but he learned from Bates that you could find 1,000 species of beetles within 10 miles of the town border. He just couldn't imagine that, but he was astonished and got really hooked on entomology. How many people are interested in entomology? I almost majored in entomology, but it stayed just in biology. But I did take entomology courses. But Wallace got into this beetling hobby and habit, and Bates and Wallace discussed a lot of their readings because they were both interested and they were considering, could we make some contribution to science? And maybe we could discover new species and stuff. So one of the things that they were hooked on was travel narratives by other naturalists, such as Alexander von Humboldt's book about South America. Wallace also read Darwin's book, The Voyage of the Beagle, and thought that was quite exciting as well. And Wallace read, and Bates also read, this anonymous work called The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, which is a philosophical work by the Scotsman Richard Chambers, who discussed how species might actually, you might have had transmutation going on, but he didn't offer any mechanism. But Wallace thought that this is something we could figure out if you study nature enough. So he visits his sister Fanny in Paris and goes to the Natural History Museum in Paris. After his observations there, he writes out in 1847 to Bates, "I begin to feel rather dissatisfied with a mere local collection. Little is to be learned from it. I should like to take some one family to study thoroughly, principally with a view to the theory of the origin of species." 1847. So Wallace is he's basically on the hunt for making contributions, and he thinks he could do it. So he doesn't know about this, but the guy who wrote this book called The Voyage of the Beagle, Darwin, was also looking into this. And he started these series of private notebooks on transmutation, his notebooks A, B, C, D, and E, in 1837, about a year and a half after returning from the voyage. And he is reflecting because others have pointed out that, hey, your birds on the Galapagos, they were actually different species of finches, and he's starting to wonder, the Galapagos tortoises are different varieties on different islands. He's thinking, well, why would they be different? And now he's starting to consider that species are no longer stable, which is what people had been thinking in Western thought for a very long time. And okay, maybe they can change. So he's been considering this, but again, he doesn't have his exact mechanism of how at that time. Back to Wallace and Bates, they met with this American author, William Edwards, who wrote A Voyage Up the Amazon. And Edwards collected insects and then sold insects to wealthy individuals who were interested in that and funded his trip, and they thought that, whoa, we could do the same thing. Why don't we try that? They went to the museum, and curator Doubleday ended up pointing out to them certain areas that had not been collected and where you might want to go, because these would be most of interest to the museum. And they're also thinking, the more exotic the better, because they'll get higher prices, and they're working guys. They have to make money to do this. And Wallace also received support from the botanist, Sir William Hooker's curator of the Kew Gardens, and asked him to collect some ferns and palm trees while he was in South America. They met a wonderful contact in Samuel Stevens, who ran with his brother this auction house where they would sell materials from all around the world. And Stevens was a big entomology enthusiast. He was treasurer of the Royal Entomological Society, and at one time in his life, he actually saved it from going under, bankrupt. He also was a member of the Zoological Society, and he enjoyed helping people out and other people who were very interested in natural history. So he said he'd act as their agent to sell material and also assist them in whatever way that they wanted. So they head off to the Amazon. They had a little bit of money saved. They headed off to the Amazon. They arrive after a month of voyage into the Amazon and begin collecting. But soon after arriving in Para, they realized that, okay, this is right on the coast, and it's not super exotic, and we've already got specimens of those. We have to go further afield and further afield, so that's what they do. And you have a very big routine of collecting. Now, some of their collecting is not necessarily what you might do today, but Wallace did not cause any species to go extinct, just in case you wondered. But he did collect a number of specimens, and this is what biologists did in the 1800s and early 1900s, and still sometimes today. I have a friend who studies bats and rodents and rabbits, and he's gone all over the world, and sometimes they do collect specimens still. But in the morning, the routines. You go around and you look for birds and you shoot the birds. If you find them, for the collections. You might have a daily thunderstorm, and perhaps you write some notes at that point. Perhaps you have a quick little bite to eat, and in the evening, in the afternoon, you're also collecting insects. So it's warmer and they're out, but different times of the day, different types of insects might be out. In the evening, you're skinning, pinning, and preparing them for shipment back to Stevens, and you're also talking with locals who are curious and interested in what you're doing. In Wallace's book, travels on the Amazon and Rio Negro. He highlights a few of the comments that they're making. Oh, the patience of the whites. Does he take all the meat out? And look, he makes eyes of cotton. They also get to know many people and they rely upon people all the time, because you can't collect everything on your own. You have to get information, you need assistance, you need porters, and Isidora is one of these people who is filled with information and helps them early on. A bit later, they send a shipment back, the first shipment. It's got quite a number of insects, and Wallace also shipped 12 chests of palms and ferns back for Hooker. And those are some specimens that Bates collected, indicating the localities in the Amazon where he collected them. They decide to split up within a year to reduce competition with each other and to collect in different areas. Bates stays for 11 years in South America collecting, and he also develops this concept of mimicry in species, and Wallace develops a concept of warning coloration from his observations and studies. He's plagued, as both of them are from time to time, by illness and hunger and famine and potential. One time early on, he's stumbling into the boat to get some material on, and the gun that he's carrying goes off, and he shoots his hand. Fortunately, it didn't damage anything other than he had to stay for about 2 or 3 weeks for it to heal and get better. But he's bitten by all sorts of pests, parasites, sandflies, wasps, mosquitoes, leeches, buffalo gnats. Of course, these are also interesting insects. And at night, every night he has to start digging out the little Cheetos and eggs they might have laid around his feet. And if you're not covered up, you might get bitten by vampire bats. And one time when Bates actually was nursing Wallace from an illness, he notes that Wallace had been in this little hut on his own for a day or so, just shaking and shivering with fevers. And Bates comes in and has to cover him up every night because he sees the slashes with the bats have been gnawing on him as well. Another time, further afield in a very remote area in the Rio Negro, Wallace is again taken by illness and fevers. Locals are whispering with each other, and he's hearing this, that what are we going to do with his possessions when he passes? Because they think he's not going to survive. He does, and he also vows here never to travel into remote areas without any other trusted assistant with him. His younger brother did come out with him and stayed about a year collecting and decided, this is not what I want to do. Unfortunately, he went back to Para, and before he shipped it out, he got yellow fever and did die in Brazil. This is a sketch, one of Wallace's sketches of fishes, and this one in particular, the freshwater stingray, Potamoto trigon wallacei, was named after Wallace in a 2016 paper when biologists found some of these fishes in the upper Rio Negro, and they matched it with his sketch from the 1840s. In a paper that is printed from material that he's sending off to Stevens, to the Zoological Society, he states that there is no part of natural history more interesting or instructive than the study of the geographical distributions of animals. And he's looking at all these fishes, these are more of his sketches, that in the Rio Negro he found 205 species on different sides of the river, in different banks, in different locations. And he states that the Zoological Society really needs to mark down their geographic locations, because without those, you're not going to get useful information to answer the important questions, such as why are there different species in different locations, and how did they get there? He also had a paper out a little bit later from his observations that notes that there's different types of monkeys on both sides of the river, not crossing that. He lives and he learns with locals. He enjoys conversations with them. He enjoys learning about their economies, learning about their philosophies, and learning about how they use natural resources. He's really enamored with this, and here's this guy from mid-1800s, raised in Victorian culture, which was extremely class biased and also rather prejudicial, and Wallace loses most of his prejudices. I wouldn't say he was completely absent of those, but he realizes after a short time living with both Portuguese immigrants here and descendants, and also local indigenous people, that every person has an equivalent level of intelligence. And he continues to think this throughout his life. Well, master your field. Master, how many fields did Wallace master? I don't know, dozens, I think. But he identified 14 palms, 5 of which still bear the name that he gave to them. He also was very keen on looking at the uses of these palms by the locals, which included thatching for their roofs, canoes, of course food, making drinks, and even insect foods that are digging into the palms themselves. And here's one of his sketches on the Caatinga palm. He's quite enamored with the forest. Remember, he started out botanizing in England and Wales, and here he's just filling in awe, looking at the Amazonian forests, and states that here no one who has any feeling for the magnificent and sublime can be disappointed by the enormous size and height of the trees. These are a couple of his sketches. And throughout his life, he carries with him this feeling of overwhelming endearment and awe when he's in the company of majestic trees. After 4 years of collecting, he goes back downriver, he visits his brother's grave, and he himself is ill again, and he's wondering whether he's even going to make it back to England. But he has some other issues to deal with, because about 3 of the years of his collections never got shipped away, even though he sent them downstream, because officials are thinking they could be contraband, or maybe they just want him to go through some bureaucratic paperwork and pay a little bit. But finally he gets onto the ship, onto the Helen, and unfortunately a few weeks into this voyage, the captain comes into his room and says, "Mr. Wallace, I think the ship's on fire," which, yes, it was, and he loses just about everything. He grabs a case of sketches, and a few notes, but otherwise all of his notebooks go down, all of his thousands of specimens go down, and he's still ill, and when he slides into the leaking lifeboat, it strips away some of the flesh on his fingers. What you have to do when you get into the lifeboat that needs time for the water to expand the wood, you have to bail as much as possible. And he writes later to Richard Spruce, who was another naturalist he met in the Amazon, I now began to think that almost all the reward of my 4 years of privation and danger was lost. However, Wallace stays pretty optimistic. In fact, just a couple nights into this voyage, he's out there and he's noting on some more notes. He's looking up at the stars and he says, I can't think of a better place to be to position myself to look at the heavens. They almost don't make this trip in their lifeboats, their 2 lifeboats, because they're just about out of water, but 10 days later they're picked up by another vessel, the Jorgensen, and Captain Venables assists them in getting back. It's not an easygoing trip because now you've got a crew that's double the size and they're perpetually scarce of food. They're eating moldy bread and brats and whatever they can on the last couple of weeks of that trip. Also, they have huge amounts of storms, and twice the ship almost sinks. And one time he asks the captain, whose room he's sharing, why he's got an axe by the chair that he's sleeping in. The captain tells him that in case we go down, I'm going to cut the mast off and maybe we'll ride up. They do make it back. And he thinks that, all this was hopeless, but he finds out that Stevens had insured the cargo. He's now given 200 pounds, which is more than enough to live for a year in London and present to the entomological and zoological societies and to become immersed in these groups, and they already know some of his background. And he begins to plan another trip, just about 2 weeks after he returns. I'm kind of like that too. He publishes 2 books in this just over a year in London, and that's the narrative of travels on the Amazon and Rio Negro, and also a book on palm trees and the Amazon and their uses. Unfortunately, Sir William Hooker does not write a nice critique of the book, even though Wallace collected a number of palms and ferns for him. He says it's practically useless and it has very little valid botanical information, but the guy lost almost all of his notes and most of his specimens, and he has to rely upon memory and a few letters of correspondence for the information on the books. However, he has lots of highlights of culture and anthropology, of people he encountered, and it's now considered a really good book of cultural anthropology. And Sandy Knapp, who is a botanist for the Natural History Museum in London, states that his palm tree book is really more of a general public book, about 100 years ahead of its time. He did a lot of surveying, and he surveyed in the upper river, in the Rio Negro and the Wapis of the branch of the Amazon, and his surveying efforts produced a map better than anything else at that time. The Royal Geographic Society was so impressed that they published it, and they also offered to sponsor him for his next voyage. For the next voyage, he and a young Englishman who he took with him, Charles Allen, they went out to Singapore. And he decided, after again discussing where to travel with the curators, that this would be a really good location across what we call Indonesia, which was referred to as the Malay Archipelago at that time. And he continues to work with Stevens for his specimens. So Wallace, this is Wallace's line. This zoogeographic boundary demarcates the fauna that he noted between the eastern side, the Celebes, or Sulawesi, and Lombok, and further east, and further west, looking at Bali, Java, and Borneo. These are all Asian types of fauna, Over on the east, these are more Australian types of fauna. Among the birds, among the insects, among the mammals. And Wallace was trying to figure out why were they so different. And of course, he had 8 years here. This area, this region from Singapore to northern Guinea, this covers an area about the width of the continental U.S. He traveled 14,000 miles, voyaging back and forth between islands and overland hiking for 8 years. He shipped an astonishing number of specimens. Of course, his assistants also collected, and the 2 major assistants for this were Charles Allen and Ali, a young Malayan who he hired in Sarawak, Borneo, to work with them. So about 126,000 specimens, mostly insects, over 8,000 birds. Ali may have collected half of those birds, and a few hundred mammals and reptiles, and some shells. Of these, only a small percentage are still in museums. In fact, we actually have a few of them in museums in the East Coast. I visited 2 museums last May to examine some birds of his. But in the Natural History Museum in London, 7% of his insect collection's there, and 12% of his birds. At the Natural History Museum in Oxford University, just under 5% of his insects are in that collection. So what happened to most of them? They were sold to private collectors. Wealthy collectors who were quite interested in this and wanted to show off exotic specimens to visitors and just have them. And Wallace also retained several thousand for himself for a while, but not all of these, but most of those were sold over time as his own finances kind of undulated up and down over a while. An example of this is wealthy collector is Saunders, who purchased vast amounts from Wallace, but also from other people. Unfortunately, when his estate collapsed, and so did all the tags and records, as far as we know, from this disappeared. So we don't know. So most of his specimens are still unknown. But even so, over 5,000 species were described new to science from what Wallace shipped back. And most of those specimens happened as single type specimen in museums where few had been in private collections and got noted. Wallace described several hundred, and 250 species are named after Wallace, such as this particular dwarf kingfisher in Missoula, Sux sex Wallacei. And that was one of his personal books as well. One of the things that Wallace noted while in Borneo was this flying frog, really a gliding frog, and later in the Malay archipelago, he authored and noted and described that I believe this is the first instance of a flying frog, and it is very interesting to Darwinians, as showing that the variability of the toes have been taken advantage of to enable a frog species to pass through the air like a flying lizard. This is a sketch of his of that frog. A couple of butterflies that he was collecting in Borneo. There's on the left side Raja Brooks birdwing butterfly. It's now the national insect of Malaysia, and he named it after his benefactor, Sir James Brooke, who governed part of northern Borneo at the time and assisted Wallace in housing and some supplies. And on the right is Wallace's golden birdwing butterfly. When he caught his first golden birdwing butterfly in the Moluccas, he stated, "Upon taking it out of my net and opening the glorious wings, my heart began to beat violently, and the blood rushed to my head, and I felt more like fainting than I have done when in apprehension of immediate death." And he had certainly known what immediate death might have been like a few times. There's another insect that he was collecting in Sulawesi, or the Celebes at that time. It's a really brilliant color green tiger beetle, and he states that it was rather shy and would often lead me a long chase from stone to stone, becoming invisible every time it settled on the damp moss, owing to its rich velvety green color. The coloration and patterns of animals was something that always impressed him. One other person who's been studying Wallace, George Peccoloni, who I know back in the UK, he really thinks that Wallace had almost a perfect memory for all of the thousands of specimens that he was looking at and comparing the variations between them. In western New Guinea, around Waigu, Dori area, he collects these unusual flies called staghorn flies, and they have, for the males only, these extensions of their eyes, look like antlers, out on the sides. And he collects 4 different species of those, and is quite curious about them. Here's one of those flies which Wallace collected at the Oxford Museum, Natural History. And those are the 4 species that he did collect. Another group of specimens that he was collecting were shells, mostly gastropods, snails, a few marine but largely freshwater from island to island, and comparing those, 7,500. Of those, there's one paper from 2015 of 12 specimens from the National Museum of Wales that Wallace collected. And then there's another 5 referenced from the Exeter Museum. Here's a plate from the 1865 paper which Wallace put out on some of these shells. And he noted in that paper that the shells, just like all the other animals, really show a fine difference between the Australian and the Asian fauna, and that they are also important in figuring out what's going on with different types in different islands, biogeographic isolation and speciation, transmutation. But most of these are lost. I contacted John Ablett, curator of Wallace at the Natural History Museum in London, and said, I'd like to examine some of Wallace's shells, and he said, we don't have any. And the other curator said, we don't have any. So I said, okay, but you do have some of the species, and he said, yeah, come and look at those. So I went and decided to look at those by the locality that Wallace collected them. And on the third group that I was looking at, I noticed a tag that stated from the Isle of Bachian, Moluccas, Mr. Wallace. And then I found, I only had one day on this because otherwise I was looking at books, and I found 4 different shells from Wallace, or types from Wallace's collections, and John has gone on and looked at all of these, and so far he's got 106 specimens of Wallace's material. Now that's a big improvement on what Wallace collected, but it's still under 2% of the total Wallace. And we have a paper which is in revision now and submitted on this. So a couple of their shells, some specimens. This particular one was collected by Charles Allen. So I was able to determine, based upon locality and dates, who was collecting it. If it was Wallace, it might have been Wallace or an assistant, but if Wallace wasn't there, it was Charles Allen. And he highlights how pleased he was with some of Charles Allen's work, but he also highlights in correspondence how displeased he was with some of Charles Allen's work. When he writes to his sister, states that after 12 months constant practice and constant teaching, and not the slightest sign of improvement regarding Allen's poor taxidermy skills and bending wings over, he says, however he does very well, he collects insects well. He did think about maybe letting Charles Allen go, but it did work out. Wallace retained him, although Allen went off and worked for someone else for about a year, and Wallace was probably very relieved for that. And at the same time, then he had Ali working with him. Ali is this young Malayan who he worked with from Borneo onwards for about 6 of his 8 years of travels, and he relied upon Ali for everything. Whenever Ali was ill, and of course if anyone else was ill, Wallace would assist and take care of them. And whenever Wallace was ill, Ali would tend to him. And Ali, like I mentioned, probably collected half of his 8,000 birds. Ali, this is the only photo of him that Wallace took right when they finished in Singapore before he went back. In the interior of Borneo. He states that one night living with the Dayaks people, that I slept comfortably with half a dozen smoke-dried hung heads suspended over my skulls, and hung over my head. Yeah, shrunken skulls. They were collectors of that. And again, he's just quite thrilled with all of the activities people do. The only derogatory comments I ever noted from Wallace in his discussions of other cultures was sometimes he felt some people were rather lazy. And so he didn't like that because Wallace was never lazy unless he was ill. He had to be. He did collect orangutans, 16 orangutans, and shipped those specimens back. This is not something we would necessarily do today, but they did. Wallace, however, was the very first person to ever write a long scientific discussion of the habits and behaviors of orangutans in the wild. And he actually raised a young orangutan for a while, but he was quite heartbroken that it died about 3 months after he was trying to raise it. One morning in the Moluccas, he was awakened by this odd noise and discovered that there was a 12-foot python above. He dispatched Ali and another assistant to take care of it. They immediately ran off, and then they got some other locals to come back and take care of it. Afterwards, there it is. Here's in the Malay archipelago the picture of that experience, and here's the python skin at the Linnean Society Library. I got to see this every day for about a month and a half. 2 months. He's also noting to Samuel Stevens that the birds, like everything else, display that really strong demarcation between Australian and Asian types of specimens, though the islands of Bali and Lombok, of nearly the same size, the same soil, aspect, elevation, and climate, and within sight of each other, they're only about 20 miles apart, differ considerably in their productions, meaning natural specimen production species, and in fact belong to 2 quite distinct zoological provinces. And he also states to Stevens, he's sending off these shells, and a little note here, the domestic duck is for Mr. Darwin, and perhaps he would also like the jungle cock. Darwin had written a lot of collectors and other naturalists, and requested if he might get some domestic varieties in different lands, in Asia, in Africa, in South America, and Wallace is obliging to this person, not knowing that Darwin's actually using these for ideas of speciation, transmutation. He receives another correspondence from Darwin a little bit later in 1857, and Darwin's stating that one of the subjects on which I have been experimenting, which cost me much trouble, is the means of distribution of all organic beings found on oceanic islands. And any facts on this subject would be most gratefully received. Land mollusks are a great perplexity to me. But Darwin did work on some of this on his own and figured out a fair amount. A few months later, he gets another letter from Darwin. This is after Wallace had written this paper, which is on the law which has regulated the introduction of new species. He sent it off to Samuel Stevens, and in that paper he states twice that every species has come into existence, coincident both in time and space, with a pre-existing closely allied species. He's strongly suggesting that transmutation is going on. He doesn't quite have the mechanism here, but he's noting from all the geographic variations within islands and between islands that this is happening. It has happened. And Darwin, his agent, Stevens, tells him to stop theorizing and just start collecting one. And so he feels a little castigated by that and notes it to Darwin in the prior letter, and Darwin tells him that I am extremely glad to hear that you are attending to distribution in accordance with theoretical ideas. I am a firm believer that without speculation there is no good in original observation. So few naturalists care for anything beyond the mere description of species, but you must not suppose that your paper has not been attended to. Two very good men, Sir Charles Lyell and Mr. Edward Blythe at Calcutta, specifically called it to my attention. And Wallace is quite elated to hear that Charles Lyell had considered his paper. And he actually had a few lines in his paper kind of jabbing at Lyell, because he knew that Lyell accepted extinctions but had nothing on transmutations. He's like, well, you gotta have this too. And Lyell also tells Darwin at this point that you should put out something on what you're writing about, what you're thinking about, because he has told Lyell and Hooker and Huxley and a couple of other people this, but nothing else. Nothing's been in publication. But Darwin's still thinking, it's not ready. I'm not ready. Just an example of the hut he lived in part of New Guinea, and part of his travels up to New Guinea. And in this area here, the crew on their little Indonesian Fram, they almost died, because even though the winds were supposed to be with them, it was a very atypical season. They kept getting blown away, and they almost ran out of water and died of thirst. They had no water for a couple of days. They made it up to this little island here, and at the top of the island, Wallace found a muddy pool, and that's what they had for water. They made it the rest of the way. He also lost 2 men there when they got back on the ship, and they went down, and again, the winds took them away. They couldn't get back. So 2 weeks later, after they were in New Guinea, he sent a ship back, and they rescued those guys. While he's in part of the Moluccas in Ternate, he's again taken ill with a malarial type of fever. Ollie's attending to him for about a week. And while he's doing this, he's also thinking, when he's conscious, about all the observations he's made, all the variations of species, what's going on, what will actually produce their changes, the transmutations. And he thinks about a paper by Thomas Malthus, who highlighted the problems with human population growth and the limited food resources, and at some point you have competition for these limited resources and maybe famine and war because of that. And Wallace gets the idea that, apply this to all life, because all life has competition and limited resources. So he pens out that, vaguely thinking over the enormous and constant destruction, it occurred to me, why do some die and some live? And the answer was clearly that on the whole, the best fitted live. So he's now got his mechanism. He writes out a paper, 14 pages, sends it off not to Stevens, but he sends it off to Darwin. And it is on the tendency of varieties to depart indefinitely from the original type. Darwin is rather petrified when he receives this. You can see how petrified he is. And that he now doesn't know what to do, because he's been working on this idea. He has been working on this idea, and this is very parallel to his own work, using a lot of the same concepts and principles and observations. So he throws his hands up and asks his friends, Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker, what should I do? Because I've got to publish Wallace's work. It's really good. He even mentions Lyell here, that please show it to Sir Lyell. And, I have to do this. But I don't think it took them much, but they convinced him that, okay, we can jointly publish your work, okay? Because you've got a little bit that you've already sent, and you had this little excerpt that you sent off to North America. We can use that. And so they work to get it together, and here's from Lyell's notebook in 1858, and it shows June 27th, Joseph Hooker and he are discussing about Wallace and Darwin's 2 papers, and then on July 1st at the Linnean Society, they present Darwin and Wallace's selection of species paper jointly. Darwin isn't there. His 2.5-year-old son had just died, even though he's 18 miles away. He's not there. And Wallace isn't there because he's 6,000 miles away. He doesn't know about this for many months. But he finally gets a paper months later, and it lists him and Darwin on this joint paper. He's quite excited. He sends off a letter to his mother. I sent Mr. Darwin an essay on a subject in which he is now writing a great book. He showed it to Dr. Hooker and Sir Lyell, who thought so highly of it that they immediately read it before the Linnean Society. Wallace is also working on a book on evolution. He doesn't call it natural selection, this was Darwin's term, but Darwin publishes this book, which I think is a rush job because Darwin had sat on it for 20 years, and now he's moving quite speedily ahead, and it's probably less than half the size that he originally wanted. But by being less than half the size and by rushing through it, it's actually quite readable. It's written in a fashion that any educated person can go down and look at it and consider the thoughts and the support for it. And it makes a big influence, huge influence, not just among scientists, naturalists, but also among the wider public. It never would have been in this form without Wallace putting a little fire under Darwin's butt. What if Wallace had sent off his manuscript somewhere else for publication? When I asked you to raise your hand if you had heard of Wallace, about 30% maybe did, and 100% heard of Darwin. You would have heard of Wallace, but this is what happened historically. Wallace was also writing his own book, but unfortunately he put it down after he saw Darwin's outline and decided to, Darwin's going to do this. But he did write a book years later, and he's not the best person for his own publicity because what does he call it? And this is Alfred Russel Wallace's book on natural selection and evolution. He entitled it Darwinism. He also had to contend, he lived many decades beyond Darwin, and he had to contend with the critiques over natural selection. He considered himself more Darwinian than Darwin because he was always fighting for and protecting natural selection, even when Darwin kind of him-hawed around with neo-Lamarckianism resurfacing for a while. And then later with the mutationist idea that this might be the major process for evolution, or Mendelian genetics, which just started to resurface in 1900, and Wallace lived in 1913, so he also had to apply critiques to this. If he'd only lived another 10 years or so, he would have seen the Neo-Darwinian revolution, which if he had lived, it might have been called the Neo-Darwinian Wallacean revolution, but the geneticists forgot Wallace's name. And he also considered that sexual selection, which was a Darwin idea that different animals, the males and females, have different traits, such as colorful birds and drab birds, and very singing birds, big antlers on some, and not so on others. He considered this was just a variation of natural selection, which most biologists would agree with today. But in fact, Darwin, on his book on sexual selection, raved about the beauty, and he kept talking about the beauty, and Wallace is writing on the annotations, no, it's natural selection, it's not the beauty, and it's that those males have better traits for the females, better adaptive traits. The last thing in Wallace was a trip much later. He did a lot of other stuff before, but he went out to see the big trees. So he was fascinated with these. There's this author and artist, Marianne North, in the 1800s, and she wrote this book on recollections of a happy life, and she highlights in the book different large trees. And he's also looking at these trees everywhere she's got the big trees, he notes big trees, and she states that there's a tree over 400 feet high. The woodman fell, and he's quite interested and excited about this. And this is one of the pictures that Marianne did. She was quite an artist. But he also is a very big critique. He edited lots of things. He knew how to review things and correct them. And when Marianne North is writing about the hornbills, and hornbills Africa, but then she put toucans in Africa, and he said, no, it's the hornbills, not the toucans. He knew where the biogeographically correct location was for these fauna. So he goes out to California. He goes over to North America first, to Boston, on the East Coast, because he's invited to give lectures on Darwinism, natural selection, and other areas. He is considered one of the best known naturalists of his time. So he goes out to do this. He also wants to see some of the natural history of North America. And he also wants to visit his brother John, who he has not seen for 40 years, who lives in California. So he goes out, and he gives his talk. His brother sets up some halls for rent so they can present his talks, and they go fairly well, although his talks on spiritualism bring more draw than those on science, and so he tries a few of those, although one didn't fill the hallway, and he states dejectedly that they only made $1 on this talk. But his brother asks him, what do you want to see? What do you want to do besides visiting family? He says, I want to see the big trees. So he has a day out around above San Francisco in Alameda, taken out by Dr. Gibbons and Mr. John Muir to look at some of these redwoods. And he's noting the size of the redwoods. So they sit and have lunch on a stump, 34 feet in diameter. Wallace is always measuring these, always looking at the size. And there's a lot of smaller ones growing there. He does complain about the heat, though. He doesn't like that. Later, he goes to look at the sequoias. He purchased this book in San Francisco. There's his signature from San Francisco, May 1887, and he uses that when traveling around in California to note any location for the plants that he's seen. And he has a few other things here, but the only personal edit I ever saw in the whole book was one location. He has some plant there, and he says, John's cow. So it must be near his brother's cow on the farm. So here he notes some of the big trees in the Calaveras Grove, meadows, sequoias, and the Stanislaus River. He also writes about the falls in Yosemite Valley, and later he produces an article and states that the Yosemite Valley is one of the most beautiful that he's ever seen. Here's the Big Trees Hotel where he stayed at for a few days, and he walks, and he's walking 6 miles or more one way to go look at the groves and then come back, measuring the trees all the time. And in an article, a couple of articles he wrote on these, he states, of all the natural wonders I saw in America, nothing impressed me so much as these glorious trees. And here's one that had fallen about a century before, the father of the forest. He measures it out and indicates that at a minimum it had a height of 270 feet. But he also considers that maybe before it fell, it could have been 400 feet high. Now, there are no trees 400 feet high today, but it's possible before some of these were cut down. There were. There are some that are over 300. Another of Wallace's notes. Unfortunately, these alone are within the power of man totally to destroy, as they have been already partially destroyed. He was a conservationist from the 19th century. Let us hope that the progress of true education will so develop the love and admiration of nature that the possession of these altogether unequal trees will be looked upon as a trust for all future generations, and that care will be taken before it is too late to preserve not only 1 or 2 small patches, but some more extensive tracts of forest in which they may continue to flourish in their fullest perfection and beauty. So I didn't cover many of these books. I'm going to be working on papers out of them, but all these books were donated to the libraries in England from Thomas Henry Riches, who grabbed them, I think in 1913 after Wallace passed away, and then in 1915 they were donated to the Linnean Society, mostly natural history books and biogeography books, science books to the Linnean Society, and then philosophical works and fiction books, poetry books, over to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, but then that was subsequently donated to the Center for Research Collections at the University of Edinburgh. And I would like to thank my good friend, Robert Fly, from high school, who came out with me twice and enjoyed reading books with me, or at least looking at annotations. I didn't know he wanted to do that so much, but he did, so he helped a lot. He probably went through several thousands of pages, tens of thousands really. And I think we covered several hundreds of thousands of pages looking for annotations. It really is a very quick work to do as much as you can in the time you have. And John Hadlett to Yale College for their support, and both the librarians at the Linnean Society and the Center for Research Collections. If you have questions, let me know.
So you mentioned that he sent collections back from Brazil.
Yes.
How did they do that?
They shipped them in crates.
And how long did it last? And how many of them actually made it and survived?
Well, the first 6 months, they actually, while he was working directly with Henry Walter Bates in South America, they were able to prepare everything, and they went upriver a little bit and then came back, and went upriver and came back, and he got material back, thousands of specimens back. But then, after about 6-10 months, he splits with Henry Walter Bates because they want to not compete with each other and collect in different areas, which is fine. And his brother joins him for about a year, but then goes back downriver and catches yellow fever and dies. All of those materials for most of those 3 years after the work with Henry Walter Bates, they never made it back, because when he got back down, they were all stored in the warehouse, not shipped away as he wanted, but they had been stored in the warehouse for contraband, and so he had to go through red tape to indicate that yes, these were specimens and they're going to museums, they're going to collectors, it's okay. He had to get that okay. Unfortunately, half of the specimens at that time were already so moldy in this warehouse that he had to toss them, but he still had thousands not tossed, but they all went down to the ship, the Helen, when it burned. In the West Indies, he kept sending specimens back at every major port after he had a few weeks or even sometimes a few days of collections. He would crate them up and ship them back as either sailing vessels or sometimes some steaming vessels would come by and take materials on, and he kept shipping them back. So those, as far as I know, almost everything from the West Indies made it back, 126,000 specimens.
Wow.
Yes?
Is the Wallace line still as distinct, or with transportation and air flights and stuff?
It's still distinct, but I mean around the planet. Oh, is the Wallace line still distinct? Let's go back to that really quick. It's a ways back, right? So I think it's worth focusing on there. So the Wallace line is here. And it demarcates this island grouping over here, which is Australian in faunal origin and also floral origin largely. And then everything over on this side is Asian. Now, he was not the first to ever notice that there were some differences, but he was the first to describe them in such detail and write about them so much and use them for Wallace was one of the founders of biogeography. he probably produced far more on biogeography and publications on that than Darwin ever did, and most other naturalists of the 19th century, although many others were big contributors. But I think Wallace was the biggest one. So here he's noting that the differences between the birds, here's Bali and here's Lombok, it's just 20, 30 miles apart. They're completely different. Why would they be completely different? Because all the way along here, he's finding animals that are Asian, and then all of a sudden, Australian. Same over here, Asian, Australia. And it is because there's a deep divide and because of continental drift, which he didn't know about at the time, but he did note that there was a relatively deep oceanic rift between these different areas. And the guy really, he's got an incredible amount of detail on all the specimens that he collected, that he wrote about. The Malay Archipelago is probably, if you were to read any Wallace book, I would recommend that one. This is something that, it's a big book, but it's highly detailed. It talks a whole bunch about his cultural interactions, his travels, and it highlights sort of grouping in island by island, the different specimens that he's looking at, and habits. He's the first person to actually describe, and he did collect, and locals did collect for him several birds of paradise, but he's the first person to actually describe a lekking behavior of birds of paradise in New Guinea.
What are you on your tour hoping to find in New Guinea?
It's for a friend's company who asked me a few years ago. He said, well, we've never been, they're called Wild Latitudes if you want to look them up. We've never been to New Guinea, we'd like to go to New Guinea, and they do birding and wildlife tours around the world. And he said, you've been there, which I have been decades ago, and he said, we never go anywhere when someone else has not been there, but if you were to develop a tour, we'll have you as the co-leader. So I said, okay. So I put in a lot of hours and I developed that tour, and he's telling me that, oh, Jeff, I don't think that we got to keep the cost in because we can't charge too much for my clients, you know. It's like, really, Steve? Your clients are successful retired business people, lawyers, doctors. I think they can handle it. But New Guinea is not the cheapest place to travel in. And after it got listed, he calls me 2 days later and he says, it filled up. Okay, yeah. But we're mostly doing a birding and wildlife and some cultural interactions. And I'm hoping, I don't know, I've been trying to email people. There's not a lot of people really on the internet there, but I've been trying to email people because I spent a couple of weeks with these people from out of Goroka, Benabena area, and I will hook up with some people from Benabena, but I'd like to see if I could find my friend Sania or some Thomas Sania or some other relatives there. And I'm going to bring copies of photos I took, which I've already mailed them, but that was a few decades ago. Yeah. So, but otherwise, we're doing that. And the other thing was I told him that I will do this as long as my son can be my assistant. So he's also supporting largely without pay my son to go and travel on that. And my son has the travel bug for some reason. Yes?
Did you mention that you did some research on mammals in Tasmania?
Yeah, my master's work was on the biogeography of Tasmanian mammals.
What are they? I didn't think they had them there.
Oh, no. Tasmania is the smallest,
Yeah.
well, not the smallest, but it's the largest island off of Australia. It is part of the Australian continent. But the two most famous mammals in Tasmania would be the Tasmanian tiger or thylacine. Cynocephalus is that particular one, sometimes referred to as the Tasmanian wolf, which may or may not be extinct because of human extirpation efforts in the 1800s to early 1900s. But the other one that's still there and doing fairly well is the Tasmanian devil. They have several types of kangaroos. They've got brush-tailed possums. They have spotted wolves, little marsupial mice, and they have some native bats and
Okay,
rodents.
into mammals and marsupials, they're,
Marsupials are mammals, yeah.
oh, okay.
Yeah,
that's what
yeah,
I
it's
thought.
just a long split.
I
About
got it.
135 million years ago, the placental and marsupial line split. Yes.
I have two questions. One on the nature of the Wallace line. So I know that over the history, two distinct groups of hominids crossed the line.
Oh, yeah.
The Homo erectus that would eventually become Homo floresiensis,
Yeah.
and the sapiens that would eventually become the indigenous peoples of Southeast Asia and Australia. Are there any other major like clades of animals that cross the line at any point, like one way or the other?
Humans brought along dingoes.
Okay, yeah.
So we have native dogs in New Guinea, and they got carried over into Australia from humans. So those did. There's several bat species that have crossed those lines.
That makes sense.
But there's not, it's amazing that even, but you have birds who are fairly capable of traveling distances. There's very few that, there's a lot of specific types on one side and then on the other. And of course, the further east you go, the more Australian it becomes.
And then my second question is the Malay boy, Ali. Was he like compensated for his work, or was he just like
He was.
a volunteer?
He was, for that time, he was well paid. Everyone that Wallace sort of worked with for some length of time, he paid. And they were fine with whatever payment he had. And Wallace himself had difficulty getting payment, shipments sometimes from Stevens, so he was often low on pay. But people liked him. And Ali, when he finished, he gave Ali his guns, which was an astonishing amount of costly items for Ali at that time. And now there's one more thing I'll add about Ali, is that Wallace wrote about him. He really, I think they really were strong friends. You know, they had such love and support for each other, and he missed him. And yet he couldn't write Ali. He would have done this all the time. But Ali was uneducated. Ali, informal education, he couldn't read, and Wallace didn't know how to send anything. And one time, in the late 1800s, or actually maybe it was around 1900, he gets this letter from a zoologist, I think an American zoologist, who is talking to Wallace, and he says, I was over on this island, and this is where Ali ended up staying. He had married, and he ended up staying and raising a family there. And he says, I'm out collecting, and this Malayan, who's now maybe 60 years old, comes up to him and says, my name is Ali Wallace.
Oh.
And he describes some of the things that he had done with Wallace. And Wallace, I think the closest I ever saw in any of his writings to swearing is when Wallace was describing this correspondence he had with this zoologist, and the zoologist had included some photographs of local people in traditional garb, and Wallace is like, no, why didn't you show me a picture of Ali? Because that's what he wanted to see. Not that he didn't, that he disliked these other people, but he wanted to see his friend. And he had no way of communicating with him otherwise. But they spent 6 years together.
So I take it there's no biography of Wallace.
Oh, there's a lot of biographies of Wallace. And I'm sort of working on one too, but I have to do some
Like
other
it's
papers
collected
first.
in one source or
Your recommendation? I have to check. If you want, I'll email you and you can send out, because I've gone through several. And there's this one, it's not Dispelling the Darkness, there's another one, I went to the talk, he's an American zoologist who wrote this book. That would be the one I'd recommend, but But I'm not even reading it because I don't want to read any biographies right now if I'm going to work on one. I'm only reading Wallace material.
I can research it, so thank you.
But I gotta see the, I'll have to check on that.
It seems like I've seen somewhat of a version of this, a documentary on television or a film.
There have been a couple on Wallace,
Oh, okay.
not
Haven't
much,
seen,
but there have been a couple.
BBC or something.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so that's out of my mind.
And in the back,
I'm just curious about the Wallace line again. Marine mammals, do they?
yeah, they cross back and forth, as far as I know,
Yeah.
they do. But Wallace was not working on any marine mammals, it was all terrestrial stuff. But he ate whatever locals were eating. You know, on one island, I don't know if it was, maybe it was Lombok, but locals were capturing dragonflies and roasting those, and he enjoyed eating the dragonflies. It's a rather, I think it's a rather Euro-centric prejudice that we have against insects, even though you'll eat shellfish, you'll eat crustaceans, but most of us won't eat insects, but I've tried them a few times and they're pretty good, depending upon the ones you have. The one here in Arizona I tried when I was at Petrified Forest, were the sphinx moths. I was cooking on a coal and stove and they're phototropic and they kept going into the fire there and I tried to shoo them away. And then after they, I had a couple of them roasted and my students were there. I thought, oh, I read that the Native Americans like these, so I tried one and it was nutty and sweet.
Come to one of our nature camps.
What's that?
Come to one of our nature camps, we'll feed you all kinds of.
Okay, I'll try that. In Queensland, I tried the green leaf ants, because someone told me that the locals, the Aborigines, would slap their hands together and crush them and then eat them. So my son and I tried that, and they tasted like citrus.
I think the rubber product tastes pretty good.
Yeah. So, any other questions? All right. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Please check our website for upcoming programs and come see us again really soon. We appreciate you being here.
And I'll send you an email on some Wallace biographies.
Perfect.